Hi there, and welcome to Creative Art Projects. Today, I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator to create this Celtic knot design. Let's start by setting up our document. First, name this something like Celtic knot design. Then, set the units to millimeters. Obviously, if you prefer, you could use inches or points. It doesn't really matter as long as you remain consistent throughout the project. Set the width to 620 millimeters and the height to 330 millimeters. Now, toggle the advanced options and set the color mode to RGB. Now hit Command or Control K to open your preferences. Go to Units. Now stroke weight is normally measured in points, but here I'm going to set it to millimeters. If you're not using millimeters, just make sure that your general and stroke are set to the same type of unit. Next, go to Guides and Grids and set Grid Every to 10 millimeters and also set subdivisions to 10 and hit Enter. Check that your fill is set to none and let's choose a nice bright green for our stroke. While we're here, let's hit Command or Control R to make our rulers visible and drag out a horizontal and vertical guide. Hold down Command Option colon or Control Alt colon on Windows to unlock the guides. Select them both using the black arrow tool and click up here on Vertical Align Center and Horizontal Align Center. Marking the center of the artboard is always a good starting point. Hit Command Option colon again to lock the guides. Press the M key to select the rectangle tool and click once on your artboard. Enter 204 millimeters for the width and 44 millimeters for the height and press Enter. Use the vertical and horizontal align buttons to center our rectangle on the artboard. Let's zoom in a little so we can more clearly see where our guides and rectangle intersect. Click the plus key to select the Add Point tool and click here and here. Hit A to get the white arrow tool and select the first point. Now I want to move this point 22 millimeters to the left. In Illustrator's control panel, it shows that the X value of our point is 208 millimeters. This just means that it's 208 millimeters from the left edge of the artboard. So to move it 22 millimeters to the left, we simply type -22 after the X value and press Enter. Now, select the right-hand point. Its X value is 412 millimeters, and we want to move this point 22 millimeters to the right. So we type +22 this time, and again press Enter. While holding down the Shift key to constrain the rotation angle, use your mouse to rotate the shape 90 degrees. Now, go up to the control panel and set the stroke to 28 millimeters. Use the Zoom tool to zoom into a cross-section of the stroke. Press Command or Control' to show the grid that we defined earlier. Here, the grid really comes into its own, as it allows us to literally see the 28 millimeters that make up the stroke's width. We're going to apply a gradient to our stroke, but before we do, let's take a look at the colours we're going to use. I've named all the colours in this project, so they're easier to identify, but they don't relate to any naming system, they're just my names for these colours. I've also included the hex code. Making sure that your shape is selected, open up the gradient panel and drag it out as far as it'll go. Inside the gradient panel, click the stroke icon, because we want to make sure that we apply it to the stroke and not as a fill. Now, click this swatch to apply the default black and white gradient, and click this right-hand button to apply the gradient across the width of the stroke. Now, there are two ways to add colour stops to the gradient ramp. Firstly, we can click anywhere under the ramp to add a stop, and then double-click that stop to bring up this colour panel. If we select HSB from the drop-down, we can use the sliders to define the colour. Or, if we choose RGB from the drop-down, we can enter our hex code to define the colour. Here, I'm adding our charcoal hex code to define our colour stop. And let's just drag this white stop off the ramp to get rid of it. Before I forget, let's also change our right-hand stop to charcoal. Now, there's nothing wrong with working this way, but I'm going to use a slightly different method. First, notice that I've placed my swatches panel in a different column to my gradient panel. If I click here to expand this column, you can see that I've already saved my colour swatches here. But how did I do this? Let me show you. I just created 4 squares. Well, actually they could be any shape, and using the colour palette, I applied my hex code to each one. Obviously, this is only going to work if you already have an idea of what colours you want to use. Otherwise, you might want to mix them on the fly. But remember, we could always define some rough colours here and change them later. Anyway, with all the squares selected, click New Colour Group at the bottom of the colour palette to bring up this panel. I called this colour group Celtic Knot 1. Make sure Selected Artwork and Convert Process to Global are selected before clicking Enter. Now, we can double-click in the Swatches panel to change the names of our colours. So again, making sure that your stroke is selected, drag the swatch out and drop it onto the gradient ramp. Next, drag out a pale gold swatch and drop it here. Notice how our actual stroke updates. By holding down the Option or Alt key, you can drag out a copy of this colour stop. Here, I Option or Alt drag a charcoal stop through the pale gold stops to create a copy on the other side, and then I create one more copy. Now, I drag an Indian red swatch onto the gradient ramp, and also a salmon pink one, which I position somewhere near the middle. Now, Option or Alt drag to mirror the order of colour stops to the right-hand side of the gradient ramp. We now have all the stops that we need to create our gradient stroke, but they're not in the exact locations that we want. Now, I'm going to hit you with a tiny bit of maths here, but it's pretty simple, especially as Illustrator does most of the work for us. I want to create a 1mm line inside my stroke to the far left. The only problem is, the gradient panel shows the locations of my stops as percentages rather than in millimetres. Select the second stop in from the left and type 1 in the location field. We type 1 because we want the stop to be 1mm from the left edge of the stroke. Next, we type a /, which represents a divide symbol, and then we enter 28, because the overall width of our stroke is 28mm. Hit Enter, and we're almost there. After this number, type Shift 8 to create an asterisk. This asterisk represents a multiplication symbol. And type 100. Hit Enter, and the stop is exactly where we want it, but it's still not looking great. Select the number in the location field and copy it. Now, select the next stop along, which is a pale gold, and paste the number into its location field. Because the two stops have exactly the same location, we have created a hard-edged line. And if we look at the grid, we can see that it's exactly 1mm thick. Let's drag these colour stops over here a bit so that they're out of the way. Now, I want to create a 3mm pale gold line. But because I already have a 1mm charcoal line, this next stop will have to be positioned 4mm from the left. Let's run the same calculation again. Select the next pale gold stop and type 4 in the location field. We type 4 because we want the stop to be 4mm from the left edge of the stroke. Again, we divide this number by 28 because 28mm is the overall width of our stroke, and hit enter. And again, we multiply this by 100. Now copy the location, select the next stop along, which is charcoal, and paste the number into its location field. Press enter, and now we have our 3mm pale gold line. Use the same process for the next two stops to position them 5mm from the left and create another 1mm charcoal line. Now, set the location of the salmon pink stop to 50% so that it sits at the exact centre of the gradient ramp and the stroke. Now, we want to mirror the position of all the left-hand stops to the right so that the gradient ramp and the stroke become symmetrical. Luckily, we can speed this up a little. Carefully select the stop, which is 1mm from the left, and copy its location. Now, select its corresponding stop on the right. Type in 100, and then type a minus symbol. Paste the location that we copied, and press enter. Just a brief note here. When selecting stops that have already been positioned, it's really easy to move them or accidentally create new stops. If this happens, simply hit Command or Control Z until it returns to its original state. Right, copy and paste this stop's location to the pale gold stop that's next to it. Continue doing this until the positions of the left and right-hand colour stops match. Let's zoom out and turn off the grid to see what the shape looks like. And bear in mind that this shape's fill is still set to none, and it's only our stroke that has colours assigned to it. Okay, this might be a good time to save our stroke so that we can apply it more easily in the future. Making sure the shape is selected, just click the New Swatch button at the bottom of the Swatches panel. Okay, I want to make a copy of our shape and move it to the left. Let's start by hitting Command or Control apostrophe to make our grid visible, and zoom in a bit. Now, press Command or Control Shift apostrophe to activate Snap to Grid. This function makes the grid even more powerful, but you won't want it on all the time. Snap to Grid is also available from the View menu. Now here's a little trick that I like to use. Press M to select your rectangle tool. Making sure that your stroke is set to none and that your fill is set to any random colour, draw a rectangle in the space here. If you look in the control panel, you can see that it's 16mm wide. Now, using the black arrow, pull it over and snap it to the left side of our shape. We could copy and paste this shape to create another instance, but if you simply hold down Option and drag, it will automatically make a copy. Remember to hold down Shift to constrain the movement to horizontal. So that's Option, Shift, drag. And here we use the rectangle as a positioning guide. You can delete the guide shape now. You can see that all of the spaces are equal. Now, zoom out and make sure both shapes are selected. Press Command or Control G to group them, and click Horizontal Align Center in the control panel. Hit Command or Control Shift G to ungroup the two shapes. These group and ungroup commands are also available by right-clicking on the object. Select both shapes. Press Command or Control C and Command or Control F again to make a copy, and while holding down the Shift key to constrain the rotation angle, use your mouse to rotate the group 90 degrees. Now before we start cutting the lines, I want you to select everything and copy it. Press Command or Control F, as before, to paste in front, and without deselecting it, hit Command or Control 3 to hide it. We'll be coming back to this in a bit. Select the uppermost two shapes and press Command or Control 2 to lock them in place so that they can't be selected or moved. Press the C key to select the scissors tool and cut the line here, 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 and here. Using the black arrow tool and holding down Shift, select these two line segments. We want to move them to the front, and the easiest way to do this is to press Command, Shift, right bracket. These commands for moving things backwards and forwards are also available from the Arrange menu inside the Object menu, or by right-clicking. Now go back to the scissors tool and cut here, 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 and here, and also bring these line segments to the front. Do the same with the other shape. Now I'm going to try making the border look a little more golden. Let's drag to select everything that isn't already locked and press Command or Control 2 to lock it in place. Now press Command or Control Option 3 to reveal the objects that we hid previously. Hit Command Shift right bracket to bring them to the front, and double-click the stroke icon and give them a random colour. Here I'm going to choose magenta. Now, in the Object menu, go down to Path and select Outline Stroke. Bring up the Pathfinder panel and click on the Unite button. We now have one solid shape with a fill and no stroke, and that's exactly what we want. Next, press Shift X to reverse the fill and stroke, and let's zoom in so we can see what's happening. Let's turn our grid back on. Go to Object, Path, Offset Path, and type -1 mm in the Offset field, and click OK. With the black arrow tool, select the original outer line and delete it. Now, making sure the line is selected, go back to Offset Path and type -3 mm in the Offset field. OK, that's looking good. Let's zoom out for a second. Press Command or Control A to select everything on the artboard that hasn't been locked. Press Shift X to reverse the fill and stroke again. Press Command A to select both of the magenta strokes, and in the Pathfinder panel, select -front. As you can see, we have a few gaps. Let's zoom in on one of our gaps and draw a rectangle to bridge it. Allow it to overlap a little. I've changed the colour here so we can see them more easily. Using the black arrow and the Option or Alt key, copy this shape to bridge all the horizontal gaps. Holding down the Shift key, select all the rectangles and copy and paste them in front. Then rotate them through 90 degrees. Now select the new border area and all the rectangles, and from the Pathfinder panel, choose Unite. Good. Let's open the Transparency panel and drop the opacity a little. We need to get rid of these little areas here where our new border shape crosses our charcoal outlines. So, just as we did before, we draw a rectangle over the area and we copy it to all similar areas. Again, we cut, paste and rotate them. But this time, we want to subtract rather than add them to the shape. So in Pathfinder, we hit -front. Now I'm going to add a gradient to the border to make it look a little bit more like gold leaf. But because we made cuts in this object using -front earlier, this border is now comprised of separate objects. We want the gradient to extend across the entire border, so let's go to Object, Compound Path, and Make. Here are the colours that we're going to use. I've saved them as a group called Celtic Knot 2. Open the gradient panel again and make sure it's fully extended. And click this swatch to apply the default black and white gradient. Now let's drag the swatches onto the gradient ramp and drag to delete the default black and white stops. Position the olive gold stop at 6.4%. Position mustard gold at 31.2% and set the opacity to 80%. Position cream gold to 66.6% with opacity also at 80%. And oatmeal gold to 94.1% with an opacity of 100%. Press G to get the gradient tool and drag it from the bottom right to the top left like so. Great, now it's almost finished. We just need to add some shadows. Lock everything and let's zoom in on this area. Using the rectangle tool, draw a rectangle that's 3mm by 8mm. Now draw another that's 18mm by 8mm. Here are the colours that we'll be using to create our shadow gradients. First, select the smaller of the two rectangles and add the copper colour to both ends of the gradient ramp. Set the opacity on the right-hand stop to 0%. Set the gradient slider to 31.9%. Now, with the larger rectangle selected, drag the rust swatch onto the gradient ramp. Again, delete the default stops and position the new ones at each end. Set the opacity of the right-hand stop to 0% and set the gradient slider to 34.9%. Option drag to copy the smaller rectangle and group all three. Copy the shadows to these locations. Then copy, paste and rotate just like we did before. Lastly, unlock everything and rotate through 45 degrees. I added a background to make it look a little more like a medieval illuminated manuscript. And that's pretty much it. If you've stayed with the video this long, I hope you've learnt some new techniques or been inspired to do some of your own work using gradients and gradient strokes. I'd love to see anything that you do, so please post links in the comments below. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be posting more projects like this and some that are not at all like this. So if you don't want to miss them, you could subscribe. Until next time, happy creating.